The thing about the Busan Gyeongje ferry is that you can feel the hull talk. Not metaphor. Actual vibration through the deck plates, a language of load and current that any marine engineer learns to read the way a parent reads a cry. 12 years I've worked coastal infrastructure for Daewoo Marine Systems. Inspection, retrofit, failure analysis. My hands know salt-eaten steel the way a surgeon knows tissue. So when the deck trembled wrong at 6:14 this morning, I didn't think earthquake. I didn't think rogue wave. I thought, that's not the ferry. The frequency was too low. Way below what the twin diesels produce. Below what any surface chop transmits through a hull this size. It came up through the water itself, into the keel. And I felt it in my knees before I heard anything. My coffee walked 3 inches across the console. I was in the engine monitoring bay, lower deck, port side. Contractual visit. Routine vibration survey on the main shaft bearings, the kind of job where you tape accelerometers to housings and stare at a laptop for 4 hours. Deeply boring work that I happen to be good at. The waveform on my screen went incoherent. Not noise structure I didn't recognize. A pulse pattern with a period of roughly 11 seconds. Amplitude climbing. The accelerometers are rated to capture engine knock, shaft whip, cavitation. They are not rated for whatever was pushing through the water column beneath us. My name is Yoon Jae-won. I'm 44 years old. I'm a mechanical engineer, not a broadcaster, not a soldier, not a journalist. I'm going to tell you what happened in the Korea Strait and on the southern coast over the last 6 days, because I was there for the parts that mattered, and because the official accounts are wrong in ways that are going to get more people killed. I'm recording this in a basement in Tongyeong. It's the 11th of July. The power has been on for 9 hours straight, which is the longest stretch in 4 days. I need to be precise. Precision is all I have left. By 6:16, the pulse had repeated 31 times, 11-second intervals, remarkably consistent. I pulled the accelerometer data into a spectral display and saw something I'd never encountered in 12 years of vibration work. A coherent low-frequency signature below 8 Hz, with harmonics stacking up to around 40. Clean. Too clean for geological. Geological signals are broadband and messy. This looked almost mechanical, but there is no machine on Earth that produces a signature like that from below an open water ferry lane. The ferrymaster called down at 6:19. Captain Rhee, former Navy, precise man. He asked if we were having an engine issue because the helmsman reported sluggish rudder response. I told him no. The shaft bearings were nominal. Whatever was affecting the ferry was external. He went quiet for a few seconds. Then he said the sea surface to the southwest looked wrong. I climbed to the vehicle deck. The big doors were closed, but there's a crew access hatch on the starboard quarter. I stepped out into a clear morning. Visibility was maybe 20 kilometers. Wind under 10 knots, sea state calm. Busan's skyline sat behind us to the northwest, gray and angular. To the southwest, maybe 6 kilometers out, the water was different. Not rough, not discolored exactly. The surface looked textured in a way that didn't match the prevailing swell. As if something very large and very deep was displacing water upward without breaking the surface. The best comparison I can make is the visual distortion you see above hot asphalt, except horizontal, across the water. I watched for maybe 90 seconds. The texture moved, not with the current, against it. My phone had signal. I pulled up the Korea Meteorological Administration's marine page. No advisories for the strait. I checked the USGS earthquake feed. Nothing in the region above 2.0 in the past 12 hours. Captain Rhee came on the PA and announced a minor course correction. His voice was even, professional. but I noticed we were turning northeast, adding distance between us and whatever was happening to the southwest. I went below and saved the accelerometer files to a USB drive. I still have it, time-stamped, unedited. It is the earliest known recording of the signature, 11 minutes before the ROK Navy's first detection. That matters. What happened to the Navy's response matters. I'll get there. The ferry docked in George at 7:05. Normal arrival. Passengers drove their cars off. I walked my equipment case to the dock office, filed my preliminary survey, and called my project manager in Busan to report the anomalous vibration data. He said he'd flag it for the Naval Architecture team and told me to proceed to my next site, a dry dock inspection at the Okpo shipyard, 3 kilometers south. I drove the coast road. The morning was beautiful, warm, humid, the hills impossibly green above the harbor towns. George Island has that quality where the industrial and the pastoral exist in the same frame. You'll see a 300-meter supertanker in dry dock, and then turn a corner into terraced vegetable gardens, and grandmother selling dried squid from a folding table. At 7:22, driving past Jangmak Harbor, I saw the fishing boats coming in. All of them. Every vessel in the small craft anchorage was moving toward the inner harbor, not racing. Moving with the deliberate coordination of people who have all independently decided to get off the water. I slowed down and watched. A cluster of squid boats were pulling alongside the quay, crews already rigging lines. An old man on a fiber-hulled gillnetter was standing at his helm, staring south, motionless except for his right hand working the throttle. I pulled over and walked down to the harbor wall. A woman in rubber boots and a sun hat was hauling crates of octopus traps off a flat-bottomed skiff. I asked her what was happening. She said the fish were gone. Not scarce, gone. Every fisherman who'd set nets overnight had pulled them up empty. Not just empty of catch, empty of everything. No bycatch, no weed, no jellyfish. The nets came up clean as if they'd been set in a swimming pool. And the water below, about 10 meters, was cold. Not cool, cold, like winter cold in July. She said this while working, not looking at me. She wasn't frightened. She was annoyed. Empty nets meant lost income. But there was something underneath the annoyance, a refusal to look south. Same as Captain Ree. Same as the old man on the gillnetter. I drove on. At the Okpo dry dock, the morning shift was already at work on a bulk carrier's rudder assembly. I set up my equipment, calibrated, and began my inspection. Normal work. Ordinary morning. At 8:41, a colleague texted me a link to a post on a Korean maritime forum. A ROK Navy patrol vessel operating south of Murado Island, that's off the southwest tip of Jeju, about 200 kilometers west of where I'd been on the ferry, had reported an unidentified submerged contact of unusual size. The post included a partial screenshot of what appeared to be side-scan sonar. The shape was indistinct, but the scale bar was visible. The contact was over 300 meters long. The post was deleted within 20 minutes. I had already saved the screenshot. I need to explain what unusual size means in context, because this is where people who weren't in country tend to lose the thread. The Korea Strait is one of the busiest maritime corridors in the world. At any given moment, there are bulk carriers, container ships, LNG tankers, Navy vessels, fishing fleets, and ferries operating in that water. The ROK Navy maintains continuous surveillance. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force monitors from the Tsushima side. There are submarine detection arrays, maritime patrol aircraft, coastal radar stations. This is not an unobserved stretch of ocean. A 300-meter submerged contact in the Korea Strait is not a submarine. No submarine in any nation's fleet reaches that length. A Typhoon class, the largest ever built, is 175 meters. What the sonar showed was nearly twice that. I didn't know what to do with the information. I'm an engineer. I analyze vibrations and metal fatigue. I sent the screenshot to 3 colleagues, added the ferry accelerometer data, and wrote, "Something large is moving in the strait. Correlates with the low-frequency signature I recorded this morning. Keep an eye on this." One of them wrote back, "Geological, submarine volcanic activity." That was the consensus for most of the first day. The Korea Strait sits near volcanic geology. Jeju Island itself is volcanic. A submarine eruption or thermal vent could explain the fish displacement, the cold water, even the low-frequency pulse. I wanted to believe it. The explanation had the right shape. But it didn't explain the sonar contact. And it didn't explain the movement. At 14:30, the ROK Navy issued a maritime safety advisory for the Central and Eastern Korea Strait. Vessels over 500 gross tons were directed to increase their separation from a set of coordinates that described a rough polygon south of Gyeonggi. The stated reason was unidentified hydrographic anomaly under investigation. No mention of a submerged contact. At 15:15, I watched from the dry dock's upper observation deck as 3 ROK Navy corvettes passed through the Okpo harbor approaches, heading south at speed. Full wake. Not a patrol formation, a response formation. At 1600, the U.S. 7th Fleet Base at Yokosuka, Japan, issued a NOTAM-A notice to mariners closing a corridor running northeast from Jeju toward the Central Strait. Reason given: multinational naval exercise. There was no exercise scheduled. I checked. By evening, the harbor at Jangmok was full. Every small craft on the southeastern coast was tied up. The fishermen sat on the quay walls, smoking, watching the southern horizon. Nobody was talking about a volcano anymore. I didn't sleep well. My hotel in Okpo faced the harbor. And twice during the night, I woke to the same low vibration I'd felt on the ferry, transmitted this time through the building's foundation. The bedside water glass rang faintly against the table. 11-second intervals. At 4:50 on July 6th, a video appeared on a Jeju fishing community's Kakao Talk group and spread to Korean Twitter within minutes. It was filmed from a black sand beach on Jeju's south coast. Pre-dawn light. The person filming was breathing hard, camera unsteady. The ocean surface about 2 kilometers offshore was broken. Not by waves. Something was displacing the water in a long, dark line, like a reef where no reef existed. The footage is 41 seconds. In the last 8 seconds, part of the line moves, rises, a shape that could be a limb or a fin or a ridge. I'm not going to tell you what it looked like, because honest description requires honest uncertainty, lifts clear of the surface, sheds water in white cascades visible even at that distance, and submerges again. The scale was wrong. The brain rejects it. You watch the video, and your first response is that it's fake, because the alternative requires you to accept that a biological structure thicker than a highway overpass just breached the surface of the Pacific Ocean off a tourist island. The video was taken down from most platforms within 2 hours. By then, it had been downloaded tens of thousands of times. I watched it on a colleague's phone over breakfast. We didn't speak for maybe a full minute afterward. At 06:30, the ROK Ministry of National Defense held an unscheduled press briefing. A spokesman in uniform read a short statement confirming that the Navy was investigating anomalous marine phenomena in the Korea Strait and around Jeju Island. He said there was no threat to public safety. He took no questions. At the Okpo dry dock, work continued. I finished my shaft bearing inspection, filed my report, packed my equipment. My next job was in Tongyong, back on the mainland. I took the coast road north to the Gyeonggi Bridge. On the bridge, traffic slowed. Not construction. People were stopping on the bridge deck and getting out of their cars to look south. I stopped too. Stepped out into morning heat and diesel exhaust and walked to the railing. The strait was full of ships, Navy gray, Coast Guard white, and behind them at the horizon, shapes I couldn't identify. A helicopter Navy Wildcat, I think, was running a low east-west pattern, maybe 8 kilometers out. I could hear it faintly over the traffic noise. And beneath it all, beneath the engine sounds and the wind and the highway, I felt it again. The pulse, transmitted through the bridge's steel superstructure into my hands, where they gripped the railing. 11 seconds, 11 seconds, 11 seconds. A woman next to me, maybe 60, was holding her phone up to film. She lowered it and looked at me. Her expression wasn't fear exactly. It was the look of someone whose categories have broken. She said, "Is that the same one, or are there more than one?" I didn't have an answer. Tongyong sits on the mainland coast, directly across the narrow channel from Gyeonggi. It's a mid-sized city built on hills above a dense harbor. Beautiful place, old naval history, famous oyster farms, a cable car over the harbor to Meruksan Mountain. The kind of city where the sea is visible from almost everywhere. I checked into my hotel at 1100 and turned on the television. Every Korean news channel was running the Jeju video. Experts were being interviewed, marine biologists, oceanographers, a retired admiral. The consensus was cautious. The video appeared authentic, but the phenomenon was unexplained. Several experts used the word geological. One, a biologist from Seoul National University, said carefully that if the object was biological, it represented a discovery that would require revision of fundamental assumptions about maximum body size in marine organisms. He was the closest to honest. The rest were performing composure they didn't feel. By noon, Japanese media was running the story. NHK reported that the Japan Coast Guard had closed waters south of Tsushima Island after their own sonar contacts, plural. The word plural did a lot of work in that sentence. 3 contacts, moving independently. The largest estimated at over 400 meters, submerged length. I sat on the edge of my hotel bed and tried to do the math. 400 meters is longer than the largest ship ever built. A blue whale, the biggest animal confirmed by science, reaches about 30 meters. What was in the water was an order of magnitude beyond anything in the fossil record, anything in the theoretical models, anything. My phone rang. My wife, calling from our apartment in Busan. She wanted to know if I was watching the news. I told her I was. She asked if I was safe. I said I was on the mainland now, not on the water. She said our daughter's school had sent a message saying all classes would continue normally, but field trips to coastal areas were suspended. Suspended, as if the ocean were a road with construction. I told her I'd be home in 2 days. Standard schedule. She said okay. She didn't ask me to come home early, and I didn't offer. And that's a decision I will carry for the rest of my life. At 1400, I drove to my inspection site, a municipal seawall on Tongyong's southern waterfront. Routine condition assessment. I parked, unpacked my testing hammer and crack gauge, and walked along the seawall recording measurements. The harbor was wrong. The tidal range in Tongyong in July should produce a waterline variation of maybe 2 meters. The current waterline was nearly 4 meters below the seawall cap. The harbor was visibly draining. Boats sat askew on wet mud where they should have been floating. Oyster farm buoys lay on exposed rock. The tide tables said it should be near high water. I measured the waterline 3 times, called the Port Authority office. They already knew. They had no explanation. The official emergence, what the media later called first visual confirmation, happened at 1642 Korean Standard Time on July 6th. I wasn't on the waterfront anymore. I was in my hotel room, 200 meters uphill from the harbor, reviewing my seawall data. The sound came first, not the 11-second pulse. Something different. A deep, pressurized exhalation, like the world's largest hydraulic system venting. It vibrated the hotel windows. I felt it in my sternum. Then car horns, many, simultaneously. Then human voices from the street, not screaming but calling out, the sound of a crowd reacting to something visible. I went to the window. The harbor was refilling. Not gradually. The water was returning in a visible surge, climbing the harbor walls, lifting the grounded boats, flooding the mud flats. And beyond the harbor, in the strait between Tongyong and Gyeoje Island, in the channel I'd driven over that morning, something was on the surface. I need to be careful here. I am not a biologist. I am not qualified to describe what I saw in biological terms. What I can do is give you dimensions, because dimensions are what I know. The visible portion extended roughly 700 meters along the channel's axis. It was not uniform. There were sections of higher relief curved, dark gray-brown, with a surface texture that from my distance and elevation looked like deeply fissured stone. Between the raised sections, the body, I'll call it, a body sat lower in the water, and the wash and foam patterns suggested a cross-section wider than the channel's navigable width. Gyeoje's near shore was maybe 1.8 kilometers from my position. The thing filled most of the visual space between the two coastlines. It was not still. There was movement, slow, massive, the kind of movement you associate with geology, with landslide footage played at normal speed. A section near the center rose, water shedding from it in falls that caught the afternoon light, and the shape suggested articulation. A joint, a limb, something that bent. The exhalation sound came again, and I realized it was breathing. The hotel fire alarm went off. Not because of fire, because the building's vibration sensors had triggered. I grabbed my laptop, my equipment case, and my USB drives, and went to the stairwell. Other guests were moving down, some calm, some not. A businessman was on his phone shouting in Japanese. A family with 2 small children moved past me in quick silence, the father carrying both kids. In the lobby, the television was still on. KBS was showing aerial footage from a military helicopter. The overhead view showed what I'd been seeing in profile. And the overhead view was worse, because from above, you could see the shape more clearly. And the shape had structure, bilateral symmetry, a central mass with lateral extensions, a tapered anterior section that could only be a head. The thing in the Korea Strait between Tongyong and Gyeoje was alive. It was longer than any structure in the city I was standing in. And it was not alone, because the Korean text scrolling across the bottom of the screen read, "Additional surfacings reported south of Jeju, east of Ulsan, and in the Tsushima Strait." Plural. The Japanese contacts were surfacing too. I walked outside. The streets were full of people looking south toward the harbor. Car traffic had stopped. The sound of the thing breathing carried up the hillside like slow thunder. The ROK military response began within the hour. I know this because Tongyong has a direct sightline to the naval facilities at Jinhai, maybe 30 kilometers northeast. And by 1800, the sky in that direction was busy with helicopter traffic. Destroyers were visible on the eastern horizon, moving south at speed. The U.S. military response was faster. 7th Fleet assets were already at sea from the Notam corridor closures the previous day. By the time the Tongyong emergence happened, a U.S. carrier strike group centered on the USS Ronald Reagan was repositioning south of Jeju. This was confirmed later. But at the time, all I knew was that American military aircraft began appearing overhead. P-8 Poseidons, the big maritime patrol planes, running long east-west tracks at medium altitude. At 1900, the ROK government issued a civil defense advisory for all coastal areas south of the 35th parallel. Residents within 1 kilometer of the shoreline were directed to move to higher ground, not evacuate. Move to higher ground as a precautionary measure. The language was careful. No one in government wanted to say the word evacuation for the entire southern coast of the country. I moved my car uphill to a parking structure near the Tongyong cable car station, about 140 meters above sea level. From there, looking south, I could see the harbor, the strait, and the creature. It hadn't moved. It lay in the channel like a new island, breathing, its bulk displacing the water into strange tidal surges that lapped against the harbor walls in rhythms that had nothing to do with the moon. Small boats that hadn't been hauled out were grinding against pilings. A Coast Guard cutter was holding position maybe 400 meters from the thing's nearest visible surface, dwarfed beyond reason. I stayed in my car and watched the sunset paint the creature's back orange and red. I ate convenience store kimbap. I called my wife. She said Busan was chaotic traffic jams as people moved away from Hyundai Beach and the coastal neighborhoods. Our apartment was 5 kilometers inland, she said. She sounded calm. My daughter, she told me, was more excited than afraid. She wanted to know if I could see it. I could see it. The military radio traffic was audible on some frequencies. I had a handheld Marine VHF in my equipment kit. Encrypted channels mostly, but the unencrypted maritime coordination frequencies were active. Vessel call signs I didn't recognize giving position reports. References to the contact and the array. And something called Pacific Corridor that sounded like an operation name. At 2100, floodlights appeared on the naval vessels surrounding the creature. White light playing across its surface. The texture I'd seen from my hotel window resolved under artificial light into something like bark, or dried seabed, or skin so thick and ancient it had become geological. The creature did not react to the light. It did not react to anything. Dawn on July 7th was the last normal sunrise I remember. I'd slept in my car at the cable car parking structure. Stiff neck, bad coffee from a vending machine that was already sold out of everything except corn tea. The creature was still in the channel. It had shifted slightly, rotated maybe 15 degrees clockwise, but otherwise hadn't moved. The water around it was brown with disturbed sediment. At 600, the ROK Ministry of National Defense held a televised briefing. A 3-star general stood at a podium flanked by naval charts. He confirmed what the country already knew. Multiple large unidentified marine organisms had surfaced in waters surrounding the Korean peninsula. He gave a number 7 confirmed, additional probable contacts being tracked. He said the organisms had so far displayed no aggressive behavior. He said a combined ROK-US Naval Task Force was monitoring all contacts. He said the situation was under control. He was lying. Not about the facts, about the conclusion, Nothing about the situation was under control. You cannot control something when you cannot comprehend its scale or purpose. The Tongyong creature, I learned later, it was designated Contact 3 in the military tracking system, began moving at 0914. I felt it before I saw it. The pulse changed. The 11-second interval compressed to 9, then 7. And new frequencies appeared in the vibration, higher, sharper, transmitted through the parking structure's concrete like a building groaning in an earthquake. I got out of the car and looked south. The channel was churning. The creature's near flank was rising, water cascading from surfaces that had been submerged, and the exposed area was immense, a wall of that bark-like hide, lifting out of the strait like a cliff face calving in reverse. The naval vessels were scattering. I could see the Coast Guard cutter heeling hard to port, throwing wake, running. The creature moved east. Not fast, maybe 6 or 7 knots, walking speed for a ship, but the displacement was catastrophic. A wave front pushed ahead of it into Tongyong Harbor. Not a tsunami, but a surge. A 3-meter wall of brown water that poured over the low quays and flooded the fish market and the ferry terminal and the first row of waterfront buildings. Car alarms erupted across the lower city. I watched the wave hit, and I watched it drain back. And I watched the creature's shape diminish eastward into the strait towards Gyeoje. And I understood something that the generals had not yet said publicly. These things were not staying in deep water. The channel between Tongyong and Gyeoje is shallow 40 meters in places. The creature had been resting on the bottom. It had been lying in the mud of a coastal channel like a crocodile in a creek. They could go anywhere the water went. By 10 o'clock, the lower harbor district was under a meter of standing water. Emergency services were overwhelmed. The fire department was running boats through streets. An elderly couple was pulled from a flooded ground floor apartment. 17 fishing boats were damaged or sunk. The oyster farms in the inner harbor were destroyed. No one was dead. Not yet. Not from the creatures. At 1100, U.S. Forces Korea raised its force protection condition. At 11:30, the ROK Navy announced a 100-kilometer exclusion zone around each tracked contact. At noon, the president addressed the nation from the Blue House and used the phrase, "unprecedented natural phenomenon," and asked for calm. The internet was not calm. The Jeju video had been joined by dozens more shaky phone footage from fishing boats, drone footage from coastal towns, one extraordinary clip from a Korean air pilot filming through a cockpit window as the plane descended into Gimhae Airport, showing 3 dark shapes visible beneath the surface of the strait like shadows of clouds, except the sky was clear. I should explain what was happening on the military side, because this is where the story most people know diverges from what actually occurred. The USS Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group had been operating south of Jeju since July 5th. The group included the carrier, 2 Ticonderoga-class cruisers, 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, and at least 1 Los Angeles-class submarine. This is an extraordinary concentration of firepower. The strike group's combined missile capacity exceeds what most countries possess in their entire arsenals. At approximately 1300 on July 7th, the carrier strike group encountered Contact 1, the largest tracked organism, the one originally detected on the Murado patrol vessel's sonar. Contact 1 had been moving northeast from deep water south of Jeju at approximately 12 knots. What I'm about to describe comes from 3 sources: a leaked after-action summary that circulated in ROK Navy channels before being classified, a personal account from a 7th Fleet sailor posted anonymously on a military forum, and the seismic data, which is unclassified and tells its own story. Contact 1 surfaced roughly 18 kilometers from the carrier group. Based on the after-action summary's description, the exposed portion was approximately 900 meters long. The full submerged body length was estimated by sonar at over 2 kilometers. The organism's cross-section at its widest point was roughly 160 meters. I'll say that again. The widest part of the animal was 160 meters across. The flight deck of a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier is 76 meters wide. This thing was twice the beam of the largest warship ever built. The carrier group maintained distance and observed. P-8 Poseidons circled at altitude. The submarine was ordered to hold position and track. For approximately 40 minutes, Contact 1 moved slowly northeast, neither approaching nor avoiding the naval formation. At 13:47, something changed. Contact 1 altered course directly toward the strike group. The Ronald Reagan began evasive maneuvering. At 33 knots, a carrier is fast for its size. But 12 knots of closing speed from something 2 kilometers long means the geometry collapses quickly. At 14:02, the strike group commander authorized warning shots. A destroyer, I believe the USS Benfold, fired its forward 5-inch gun across Contact 1's heading. Naval gunfire at sea is concussive, enormous. The rounds hit the water ahead of the organism and detonated. Contact 1 did not alter course. At 14:06, the commander authorized direct engagement. The Benfold fired on the organism's forward section. Direct hits confirmed by observation. The 5-inch round struck the creature's exposed surface. The seismic data from this moment, recorded on ocean bottom seismometers maintained by the Japanese Meteorological Agency, shows the impact signatures. And then it shows something else. A massive, singular pulse, far stronger than anything previously recorded. The pulse propagated through the water column and was detected on seismometers as far away as Guam. The creature responded, not by attacking, not by charging. The after-action summary uses a word I wouldn't have chosen. It says the creature vocalized. A sound came out of Contact 1 that ruptured the eardrums of every sailor on the Benfold's weather decks, that buckled steel plating on the destroyer's superstructure. That caused the Ronald Reagan's flight deck to flex visibly. That was heard, not felt, heard in Jeju City, 170 kilometers away, as a single low note that shattered windows on the harbor front. The strike group broke off. The Benfold was combat ineffective. 14 sailors were medevaced with blast injuries. Contact 1 resumed its northeast heading as if nothing had happened. That was the first engagement. It was not the last. By the evening of July 7th, the creatures the media had started calling them Leviathans, a word I dislike for its biblical drama, but cannot seem to escape, were moving into coastal waters along the entire southern and eastern Korean seaboard. Contacts 2 through 7 were tracked entering the shallow continental shelf. Contact 4 surfaced directly in the approaches to Busan's outer harbor. Busan is a city of 3.5 million people. Its port is the 6th busiest in the world. And a living thing large enough to be mistaken for an island was now sitting in the shipping channel. My wife called at 2000. The apartment windows were vibrating. She could hear the breathing from 5 kilometers inland. My daughter had stopped being excited and was not sleeping. I told them to pack a bag and drive to her parents' house in Daegu, 100 kilometers north, inland, away from the coast. She said the highways were already jammed. Everyone in Busan's coastal districts had the same idea. I couldn't get home. The roads between Tongyong and Busan were gridlocked. The Gyeoje Bridge was closed. The creature's earlier transit through the channel had damaged the navigation spans. I was stuck. At 2200, the combined ROK-US command attempted a second engagement, this time with standoff weapons. Harpoon anti-ship missiles launched from a destroyer targeted Contact 4 in the Busan approaches. The missiles struck. The explosions were visible from the Busan waterfront. Thousands of people filmed it. Contact 4 vocalized. The sound hit Busan like a physical blow. Windows broke across the Hyundai district. Car alarms triggered in a wave spreading inland. 3 buildings in the Marine City complex reported structural cracking. 17 people were hospitalized with ruptured eardrums. A woman on the Guanggan Bridge lost control of her car. And then Contact 4 moved. Not away, into the harbor. It came in slowly, displacing water ahead of it in surges that flooded the container terminals. Gantry cranes, the big ones, 60 meters tall, stood along the quay, like toys as the creature's flank slid past them. 2 cranes were toppled by the water displacement alone. The creature never touched them. It settled into the inner harbor basin and stopped moving. And breathed. I need you to understand the military implications of what had just happened. The 5th largest port in the world was physically occupied by an organism that could not be damaged by naval gunfire or anti-ship missiles, and whose defensive vocalization caused structural damage to a major city. The ROK Navy had spent 2 days' worth of credibility and ordnance, and had accomplished nothing except provoking a response that proved the absolute futility of the provocation. The U.S. Pacific Command went to DEFCON 3. I learned this later. At the time, what I knew was simpler. My wife was stuck in traffic trying to leave a city that now had a living thing in its harbor. And I was on a hillside, in Tongyong, watching military helicopters fly patterns over dark water. And the low sound of breathing filled the entire southern coast like weather. July 8th, day 3. The creatures were in 7 confirmed locations along the Korean coast. 2 more had been tracked surfacing in the East China Sea, west of Kyushu. Japanese Self-Defense Force vessels were shadowing them. Plan. People's Liberation Army Navy assets were active in the Yellow Sea, though China's public statements were limited to calls for international scientific cooperation. At 0400, the U.S. attempted an underwater engagement. This is the event that changed everything. A Los Angeles-class submarine unnamed in every source I've seen, which tells you something about the outcome, was ordered to engage Contact 1, now loitering in deep water southeast of Jeju. The submarine launched Mark 48 torpedoes. These are heavyweight weapons designed to break the keel of an aircraft carrier. The torpedoes struck Contact 1. The detonations registered on seismometers across the Western Pacific. What happened next was not a vocalization. Contact 1 dove. Fast. The sonar track shows it descending at a rate that should be impossible for anything biological over 100 meters per minute. Straight down, past 1,000 meters, past 2,000. The submarine attempted to follow the track. At 2,400 meters depth, Contact 1 stopped descending and moved laterally toward the submarine at what the leaked summary describes as speed in excess of tracking capability. The submarine lost sonar contact. Then the submarine lost contact with the surface. I'll be honest, the details of what happened to that submarine are not things I can confirm. What I can confirm is that the USS Ronald Reagan Strike Group received an emergency action message at 0431 and immediately withdrew northeast at maximum speed. What I can confirm is that by dawn on July 8th, every U.S. and ROK naval vessel south of the 34th parallel was moving north. What I can confirm is that the submarine's name was never publicly released. Its crew's families were contacted by Navy casualty assistance officers 3 days later. And its loss has never been officially acknowledged. You will not find it in any press conference. You will not find it in any defense ministry statement. 130 sailors died in the dark water south of Jeju, and their government has not said their names. What the engagement proved was unambiguous. The creatures could not be fought. Conventional weapons either failed to injure them or provoked responses that caused more damage to the attacker than the target. The vocalizations alone had injured hundreds. The harbor occupations were displacing millions. And the things were still arriving. By midday on July 8th, sonar arrays across the Pacific were tracking new contacts rising from deep water. Not 7, not 12, dozens. Moving north from the abyssal plains, rising through the water column, converging on the shallow coastal shelves of East Asia like something had called them home. The military option was over. It had lasted 62 hours, produced one destroyed submarine, one combat ineffective destroyer, hundreds of civilian injuries from secondary effects, and 0 confirmed damage to any creature. I'm going to move through the next 2 days faster because the pattern became repetitive, and the repetition is part of the horror. July 8th and 9th. The creatures entered every major port and harbor on the Korean peninsula's southern and eastern coasts. Busan, Ulsan, Pohang, Yosu, Mokpo, Incheon. One by one, the harbors filled. Not with water, with bodies so large that the harbors couldn't contain them. Creatures draped across container terminals, blocking shipping channels, lying in the shallows of river mouths. They weren't attacking. They weren't feeding, as far as anyone could determine. They were occupying, filling the spaces where human maritime infrastructure met the sea, as if reclaiming territory that had been borrowed. I stayed in Tongyong because I had nowhere else to go. The highways north were still gridlocked. Fuel stations were running dry. The cell network was intermittent, too many people trying to call at once. I ate what I could buy from convenience stores that were rapidly emptying, slept in my car, and watched. In Tongyong, Contact 3 had returned. It settled into the strait west of the city, and a smaller organism, maybe 150 meters, which I realize is a deranged use of the word smaller, entered the inner harbor itself. The harbor is not large. The creature filled it. Fishing boats were pushed onto the quays by displacement. The municipal fish market, a beautiful arched building on the waterfront, had 3 meters of water in its ground floor. From my vantage point above the city, I could see the creature's back rising from the harbor like a new peninsula. Birds landed on it. Seabirds, dozens of them, perching on the ridged surface as if it were rock. The creature breathed, and the birds rode the expansion and contraction of its back without alarm. The city around me was emptying. Those who could leave were leaving north to Jinju, to Daegu, inland. Those who couldn't, the elderly, the carless, the stubborn, stayed. The city government set up an emergency coordination center at the high school on the hill. I went there on July 9th to charge my phone and laptop. The gymnasium was full of people sitting on mats, watching a single television. The news showed the same footage on rotation. Aerial views of harbors choked with impossible bodies. Military vessels retreating, empty highways. Press conferences where officials said nothing with increasing formality. A man next to me, maybe 70, watched the screen with a blank calm of deep shock. He said he'd been a fisherman for 40 years. His boat was under one of them. Crushed, probably. His entire livelihood was in that harbor. He said, "They're not angry. Angry I could understand." He was right. That was the thing that made it unbearable. The creatures showed no hostility, no interest in humans at all. They were simply there, in the way that a mountain is there. and everything humans had built along the coastline was being rendered irrelevant by their presence. You cannot fight a mountain. You cannot negotiate with a geological event. You can only move. On July 9th, the United States made the decision that defined the crisis. I learned about it the way most people did, through a televised address. But let me give you the context that the address didn't include. By July 9th, the creatures were not limited to Korea. Reports were coming in from across the Pacific Rim, surfacings in the Sea of Japan, in the Philippine Sea, along the Aleutian chain. And this is what forced Washington's hand sonar contacts in the Eastern Pacific moving toward the North American continental shelf. 3 contacts were tracked passing over the Mendocino Fracture Zone, heading toward the coast of Northern California. 2 more were rising from deep water west of the Juan de Fuca Ridge, bearing toward Washington State and British Columbia. A single massive contact, the largest yet detected, estimated submerged length exceeding 3 kilometers, was moving northeast through the Central Pacific on a heading that would bring it to the Hawaiian Islands within 48 hours. The President of the United States addressed the nation at 2100 Eastern Time on July 9th, which was 1000 on the morning of July 10th in Korea. I watched it on my phone, sitting in my car, eating the last package of crackers from a 7-Eleven that had closed permanently the day before. He announced the activation of the entire Pacific Fleet. He announced the deployment of carrier strike groups to defensive positions along the West Coast. He announced the mobilization of National Guard units in every coastal state. And he announced that the United States was prepared to use all means necessary to prevent the creatures from entering American harbors and waterways. I sat in my car and felt something cold settle in my chest. Because I had watched the ROK Navy try, I had heard the vocalization that broke windows in Busan. I had seen the report about the submarine, and the man on the screen was standing in front of a flag and telling 330 million people that American weapons would succeed where Korean and Japanese weapons had failed. All means necessary is a phrase with a specific meaning in American military doctrine. It includes nuclear weapons. Within hours, the response began. The U.S. Navy established a defensive line. They called it the Pacific Barrier, running from the Aleutians to Hawaii to American Samoa. Every available surface combatant, submarine, and maritime patrol aircraft was repositioned. The scale was immense. It was the largest naval mobilization since World War II. The first engagement happened on July 10th, west of San Francisco. A creature surfaced inside the defensive perimeter, 14 kilometers from the Golden Gate Bridge. Visible from shore, tens of thousands of people watched from the Marin headlands as the Navy opened fire. Missiles, naval gunfire, aerial bombs from carrier aircraft, torpedoes, everything in the conventional arsenal, concentrated on a single target. The creature vocalized. Windows broke across the Richmond and Berkeley waterfront. The blast wave was measured as far inland as Walnut Creek. The Golden Gate Bridge. The bridge itself swayed visibly. 38 people were injured. A section of the Bay Bridge's upper deck was closed after support cables showed stress deformation. The creature entered San Francisco Bay. It settled against the Embarcadero waterfront like a barge the size of a neighborhood. It breathed. Ferries capsized in its wake. Pier 39 went underwater. The sea lions were, ironically, the first to leave. And in Washington, the conversation that everyone feared began in earnest. I need to talk about the 72 hours between July 10th and July 13th. And I need to do it carefully, because what was discussed in those hours is the reason I'm making this recording. The conventional military response had failed globally, not just in Korea, not just in San Francisco. In every engagement, in every ocean, the result was the same. The creatures could not be measurably harmed by conventional weapons. Their vocalizations caused escalating collateral damage. And they continued to move into coastal waters, harbors, and river mouths with absolute indifference to human military power. By July 11th, creatures occupied harbors in Busan, Shanghai, Tokyo Bay, Manila, Sydney, San Francisco, Seattle, San Diego, Honolulu, and Anchorage. More were arriving daily. Global shipping was paralyzed. Ports that handle 60% of the world's trade were physically blocked. The economic implications alone were existential. But the military minds weren't thinking about economics. They were thinking about the fact that nothing in the conventional arsenal worked. And that left only one category of weapon. I don't have direct access to what was discussed in the Pentagon or the Blue House or the Kremlin. What I have is what leaked. And what leaked was enough. The United States Navy conducted a classified modeling exercise on July 11th, designated Trident Azure, and the documents I've seen evaluating the use of tactical nuclear weapons against the Pacific contacts. Specifically, submarine-launched low-yield warheads detonated in proximity to submerged organisms in deep water, away from population centers. The modeling results were ambiguous. There was no data on whether nuclear detonation would harm the creatures. What the models could predict was the secondary effects: radioactive contamination of fishing grounds, tsunamis from underwater detonation, atmospheric fallout patterns. The models also predicted, based on observed behavior, that surviving creatures would vocalize in response, and that the combined acoustic energy of multiple simultaneous vocalizations could produce effects equivalent to a magnitude 7 seismic event in coastal zones. The models said, in essence, even if the weapons work, the consequences may be worse than the occupation. But the models were not what stopped it. What stopped it was the South Korean signal. On July 12th, a team at the Korea Institute of Ocean Science and Technology published an analysis of the creature's 11-second pulse. The same signal I had first recorded on the Busan Gyeongdae ferry 8 days earlier. Their analysis showed that the pulse was not random, not merely respiratory, not a simple sonar-like emission. It had structure, nested structure, variations in amplitude, phase, and harmonic content that changed in response to environmental conditions. The pulse was communicative. The creatures were talking, not to us, to each other. A constant, ocean-spanning conversation transmitted through the water column at frequencies that propagated across entire ocean basins. And here was the finding that changed the calculus. The vocalizations that had broken windows and burst eardrums and buckled steel were not weapons. They were distress calls. The creatures screamed when they were hurt. And the scream was so loud, it damaged everything around them, the way an earthquake damages buildings, not by intent, but by scale. They weren't fighting back. They were crying out. On July 13th, the President of South Korea addressed the UN General Assembly by video link from the underground command center at Gyeongdae. I watched on my phone from the high school gymnasium in Tongyeong, sitting among 100 people who had been sleeping on the floor for 3 days. She presented the KIOST findings. She presented the seismic data from every engagement. She presented the acoustic analysis showing the distress call pattern. And she said something that no military leader in any country had been willing to say. We are not at war. We have placed ourselves in the path of a migration, and we are harming ourselves by treating it as an invasion. Migration. The word reframed everything. The KIOST analysis expanded over the following hours with data from Japanese and Australian research institutions, supported the hypothesis. The creatures were moving from deep ocean to shallow coastal waters in a coordinated, seasonal, or cyclical pattern. The harbors they occupied corresponded to ancient river deltas, submerged geological features, and underwater topography that predated human civilization. They were returning to places they had been before, places that, in the deep time of the ocean, had been theirs first. The military infrastructure, the shipping channels, the container ports and naval bases and waterfront cities, all of it was built on top of habitat. The creatures weren't occupying our harbors. We had built our harbors on their resting grounds. I sat in that gymnasium and felt the building vibrate with the breathing of the creature in the harbor below. And I thought about the seawall I'd been inspecting 3 days earlier. Routine condition assessment, crack mapping, load analysis. I had spent my career measuring the structural integrity of things humans built at the edge of the sea. And it had never once occurred to me to ask what was there before we built. The General Assembly session dissolved into argument. The U.S. ambassador insisted that the creature's presence in American waters constituted a security threat, regardless of intent. The Chinese ambassador called for a moratorium on all military engagement. The Japanese representative, to everyone's surprise, announced that Japan was unilaterally ceasing all hostile operations against the organisms and inviting an international scientific mission. At 1600 Korean time, the U.S. Pacific Fleet received orders that have not been publicly confirmed, but whose effects were immediately visible. All ships withdrew to a distance of 50 kilometers from any creature. Weapons were not fired. The Pacific barrier was maintained in name only. The nuclear option was not taken. I don't know how close it came. The leaked Trident Azure documents suggest it was closer than anyone has publicly admitted. One memorandum, unsigned, contained the sentence, "The political cost of inaction must be weighed against the existential cost of provocation." Someone in that room understood that you do not fire nuclear weapons at an animal whose cry of pain can buckle a bridge. This morning, I walked down to the Tongyong waterfront for the first time since the flooding. The water has receded to something approaching normal tidal range. The streets are coated in gray mud and debris. The fish market is gutted, not destroyed, but emptied. Everything that was inside washed out or ruined. A crew of city workers in rubber boots was shoveling mud from the entrance. One of them nodded at me. Ordinary work. The kind of work that follows any flood. The creature is still in the harbor. It has shifted position, drawn slightly toward the harbor's deeper eastern basin. From the quay wall, I was maybe 200 meters from its nearest surface. At that distance, the scale stops being numerical and becomes sensory. The skin or hide or shell, I don't know the right word, is textured with ridges and fissures that look geological. Between the ridges, clusters of organisms grow, barnacles maybe, or something else. Whole ecosystems on its back, like a reef that moves. It breathed while I stood there. The expansion was visible, a slow rise of the near flank, a pause, a compression, a sound like distant surf. The air that moved with the exhalation was warm and smelled like deep ocean. Not foul, not rotten, just profoundly deep. The smell of water that hasn't seen light in 1,000 years. A fisherman was there too, standing on the quay with his hands in his pockets, looking at the creature the way you look at weather. He was the old man I'd spoken to in the gymnasium. He said he'd come down to check on his boat. The boat was gone, crushed or sunk. He already knew. He'd come anyway. He said, not looking at me. My grandfather told me about a year when the squid didn't come. Whole season. Every boat came back empty. The old men said the squid would come back when they were ready. The next year they came back. He was quiet for a moment. They weren't ours, the squid. They just came near us sometimes. Power has been intermittent. Cell networks are overloaded. The highways north are moving again, slowly. My wife and daughter made it to Daegu on July 9th. They're safe. I've spoken to them every day, though the calls are short and sometimes drop. I should be driving to them now, I know that. Instead, I'm in this basement, recording this. Because the official accounts are wrong, and the wrongness matters. Here is what the official accounts say. An unprecedented marine biological event is being managed through international cooperation. Military forces are maintaining a protective posture, and coastal populations are being supported through emergency services. Here is what's actually happening. The creatures cannot be moved. This is not a temporary disruption. Every major port in the Pacific Rim is occupied, and deep water sonar tracking shows hundreds more organisms in transit from abyssal depths. The migration is not ending. It may be beginning. Global shipping is at 40% of capacity and falling. Container vessels cannot enter their home ports. Fuel tankers cannot reach refineries. The supply chain that feeds, clothes, and powers the industrialized world runs through the harbors that are now occupied by animals the size of aircraft carriers. The military response cost one submarine its entire crew, hundreds of injuries, and structural damage to major cities, and achieved nothing except proving that the creature's defensive vocalizations make military engagement more dangerous to the attacker than the target. Trident Azure proved that nuclear weapons would likely trigger vocalizations powerful enough to level coastal infrastructure across entire regions. The weapons are off the table not because of policy, but because of physics. And here is the thing that no government has said plainly. There is no plan. There is no technology to move the creatures, no weapon to harm them, no barrier to stop them, no negotiation possible with organisms that communicate on frequencies below human hearing across ocean basins. The most powerful military alliance in human history spent 9 days in the full depth of its conventional arsenal and could not inconvenience a single one of them. The U.S. military was not broken by force. It was broken by irrelevance. The creatures didn't defeat the Navy. They ignored it. Every missile, every torpedo, every 5-inch shell was absorbed or shrugged off or simply didn't matter. And the response, the involuntary scream of a hurt animal, did more damage than any weapon the creatures could have wielded on purpose. That is what I need people to understand. The military wasn't beaten in combat. It was revealed to be beside the point. A paradigm designed to control territory and project force encountered something that doesn't recognize territory and cannot be forced. And the paradigm shattered. The generals are still on television. The carriers are still at sea. The defense budgets will still be approved. But the fundamental promise that sufficient military power can secure a nation against any threat died in the Korea Strait on the morning of July 8th, when a submarine fired torpedoes at a living thing the size of a mountain, and the mountain didn't notice. What we're left with is a world where the harbors belong to something else, and everything we built assuming the sea was ours has to be rebuilt assuming it isn't. That's not a military problem. It's not even a political problem. It's a question about what humans are when the things we thought made us dominant turn out to be irrelevant. I'm an engineer. I don't have the answer. But I know what I measured on that ferry. And I know what I've seen. And I know the official version is designed to preserve the illusion of control over a situation where control was never possible. The power has held. 9 hours and counting. My USB drive has the original accelerometer data from the ferry, time-stamped 0614, July 5th. the earliest known recording of the 11-second pulse. I've uploaded copies to 3 cloud services and mailed a physical drive to the KIOST laboratory in Ansan. If the data helps them understand the communication structure, then this week of sleeping in my car and eating convenience store rice was worth something. I'm going to drive to Daegu tomorrow. The coast road north to Masan is reported clear. From Masan, the inland highway should be moving. 6 hours, maybe 8 with traffic. My daughter asked me on the phone last night if the creatures have names. I told her not yet. She said they should. She's 8. She's not wrong. From this basement, if I'm quiet, I can hear it. Not the pulse that requires contact with the ground or a structure to feel, but the breathing, the slow, immense respiration of the creature in the harbor carried up the hillside on still air. It sounds like the ocean sounds when you hold a shell to your ear, except it's real, and it's alive. And it's been alive in the deep water longer than anything we've ever built has existed. I inspected a seawall 3 days before the world changed. I measured cracks in concrete and rated corrosion on rebar, and wrote a report about the structural integrity of a wall built to hold back the sea. The wall is underwater now. The report is meaningless. But the skills, observation, measurement, precision, the habit of recording what you see rather than what you wish you saw, those I still have. I don't know what comes next. Nobody does. The harbors are occupied. The shipping lanes are closed. The military is standing down because standing up accomplished nothing. And the creatures breathe in our harbors and talk to each other across oceans. And they are not concerned with us. And that indifference is the most frightening thing I've ever encountered. My name is Yoon Jae-won. It's July 14th. This is what I saw. One more thing. Yesterday afternoon, before I came down to this basement, I went back to the harbor one last time. I brought my accelerometer, the same sensor I'd used on the ferry, the same one I use for shaft bearing inspections and seawall surveys. Portable, battery-powered, sensitive to frequencies well below human hearing. I placed it against the quay wall, 200 meters from the creature's flank. I opened my laptop and watched the waveform. The 11-second pulse was there. Clear, strong, structured. But there was something else underneath it. A secondary signal. Much lower amplitude that I hadn't detected on the ferry because the ferry's own machinery noise had masked it. In the silence of a dead harbor with no engines running and no generators humming, the secondary signal was visible. It wasn't 11 seconds. It was continuous. A sustained tone almost below the accelerometer's detection floor, with slow modulations in frequency and amplitude that looked, and I want to be very precise about this, that looked like language. Not human language, not any symbolic system I can decode, but structured variation with non-repeating patterns and what appeared to be call and response timing. The creature in Tongyong Harbor would produce a modulated sequence. Then silence, not absent silence, but waiting silence. Then a response from a different bearing, carrying through the water from another creature somewhere else along the coast. They were talking, constantly, below everything, below the pulse, below the breathing, below the threshold of human hearing. A continuous conversation conducted through the medium of the ocean itself. I recorded 11 hours of it before my laptop battery died. The file is on the USB drive with the ferry data. I don't have the expertise to analyze it. I don't know if anyone does. But I keep coming back to what the fisherman said. His grandfather waited. The squid came back when they were ready. They weren't ours. They just came near us sometimes. Maybe this is what the water sounds like when it isn't drowned out by our engines. Maybe this conversation has been happening beneath every hull and every pier and every harbor wall for longer than we've had harbors. And we're only hearing it now because the speakers got too large to ignore and too close to miss. The power is still on. I should sleep. Tomorrow, Daegu. Tomorrow, my family. The creature breathes. The water carries the sound uphill. It doesn't sound like a threat. It sounds like the ocean talking to itself the way it always has. I just never had the equipment sensitive enough to listen. This is Lost Signal Broadcast. Subscribe and turn on the bell for the next signal. Leave your report below. Until then, keep your radio close.